First up, he is national correspondent for The Atlantic, whose current cover story is the tragic decline of the American military. Jim Fallows. Jim, hey, great pleasure.
Thank you, Bill.
How you doing?
Appreciate it.
Well, I read your article. You're a pretty brave guy to call it what you did, the tragic decline. You must be worried that the American ISIS is going to get you.
Well, it's among the heartening reactions. I've gotten thousands and thousands of messages, mainly from people in the military, mainly saying thanks for pointing out these issues.
And it is such a sacred cow, the military. I mean, I say the same thing here for years on this show. I mean, I've talked about this. And what bothers me is that they do a little three-card Monte trick. If we say, if we criticize the Pentagon spending, defense contractors, they turn it into, well, you're denigrating the troops. And those are two different things, aren't they?
Oh, of course. And what struck me most, the argument I was trying hardest to get across here is anything we take seriously and know, whether it's the school system, the medical system, the press, or whatever, we know that it has good and bad aspects. The military, we don't act that way anymore. We have to treat everybody as heroes. We let them get on the airplanes early. We give them a salute at halftime. Then we don't think about the jobs we're sending them to do, the weapons they have, and all the rest.
I mean, I support the troops. I think we all do. But we do treat them almost like we treat children now, our precious little angels.
Where you can't say anything bad. And again, a very interesting thing I've heard from so many soldiers and Marines have written back is saying that when they hear, thank you for your service, we support the troops, what they want to say is, you want to thank me for your service. You know, vote on the wars we're going to. Be a citizen. Pay attention to these jobs.
I've always said the same thing. If you want to support the troops, don't send me to this pointless military stalemate.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's just get down to brass tacks. What do we spend? Now, you basically say $1 trillion.
Yes.
I mean, I think the Pentagon baseline budget is almost $600 billion. Then you had another couple of $100 billion for the wounded warriors,
et cetera.
Come back. Nuclear, that's a different department. I don't think you're even including Homeland Security in this.
No, I'm not. So it's about $1 trillion. You just have the military per se, plus pensions and
But adding Homeland Security, it's even more.
It's more
to keep the monsters away. And this is how much more than what every other country spends.
Well, the most interesting contrast, I think, is our economy is, of course, the biggest in the world. China has, so it'll reach there sometime. We spend twice as large a share of our GDP, about 4%, as the rest of the world does on average. So we're the biggest economy. We spend twice as much as the next 10 or 15 countries together. It's by far the biggest input of money of any country in the world.
Right. And you're not afraid to use the word chicken hawk. And you're also not afraid to say that the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, we lost. And you'll never hear a president say that. Of course, Obama starts every speech, as every president does, State of the Union is strong. You make the point, no, by any real measure, we lost those wars.
Right, and there are battles we won all the way along. But if you look, anybody who writes the history of this era will say the biggest strategic mistake we made was invading Iraq, without provocation a dozen years ago. And this has been a decade plus of strategic defeat for the United States. I think in the piece I used the line that the trillions of dollars we spent on these wars, 2 or 3 trillion, nobody really knows, might as well have been burned for the good they've done for the United States, for the world.
Right, and you also make the point that the only real strategic victory was killing bin Laden.
Right, which we could have done years earlier. I mean, it's good that it happened at all, but one of the many things that went wrong with the war in Iraq was the diversion of the effort to rout bin Laden and his troops from Tora Bora, and so that was when he was on the run early. It took another decade to get him.
Right. I mean, if I've asked this at panels before, if we had only reinforced the cockpit doors on airplanes and killed bin Laden and not done all the other stuff, wouldn't we be in better shape now?
We sure would, and I think people would have this kind of discussion. It would be debated in presidential campaigns, as hardly as at all. It would be a subject of common knowledge if the public at large was connected somehow to the military. If you take everybody who's fought in all the wars of the last dozen years, at any time, it's 0.75% of the population. There are twice as many farm families as there are people in the military now.
I mean, the ironic thing is that when people say, well, we should never cut the military, of course, there are people who never look into how much we spend on the military, what that money is going towards. Really, spending that much makes us weaker because we don't have money to spend on building our nation at home. We don't have the infrastructure of other countries. We don't have a lot of things other countries have because we waste 20% of our budget on basically fighting Russia in 1978.
Oh, it's true, and the aircraft.
We have, what, 10 aircraft carriers?
We have, yes, we have more aircraft carriers than anybody else. The Chinese have one. They bought a used one from Ukraine. That's going to be a long time before that's a threat. You know, politicians have known that the main way you can do infrastructure or investment in the United States is to call it defense. You know, Dwight Eisenhower with the National Defense Interstate Highway Act and all the DARPA, which got the internet going. It would be so much more efficient if we could actually invest in these things for the long run without the leaky sluice.
But Eisenhower, you mentioned Eisenhower. He's the one who said we have to watch out for the military-industrial complex. If he made that speech today, he would probably ask to apologize for it. Bill O'Reilly would call him a pinhead.
If anybody goes back to read that farewell address that Eisenhower gave in January 1961, it is incredible because he warns about things that 50-plus years later are the reality of having the impact of military contracting, of military shaping foreign policy, that this was something he, as a former commander of the greatest fighting force in the history of the world, was saying this was a caution to be, this was a caution to observe.
It's funny, in his era, and the era that followed when they were talking about his era, World War II, you could make fun of the military. Television and movies were full of funny military people. Sergeant Bilko, Hogan's Heroes, McHale's Navy.
Gomer Pyle.
Gomer Pyle, right. You could never do those shows today because it shows military people could be less than saintly.
And I think that is a crucial point. That's a sign of a country comfortable enough with its military to make fun of it. To know that, like any other human institution, it was good and bad, and preposterous and noble. And collectively, it was great, but it had a lot of people who weren't great. And now, in these 12 years of war, we've removed commanders for sexual peccadillos and for leaking to the press, but not for these battlefield failures that have been so terrible for the country and for the world.
All right, Jim, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Great work. If you get a chance to read it in the Atlantic.